Chapter 1. Princess, please read the full text. This is a highly rated, completed historical romance novel. Praise to the princess who lost 15 pounds, and to the ordinary princess who gets rich every year. Get your Wi-Fi ready, prepare your potato chips. Willow reminds you, the main story begins now. My name is Charlotte, my dad is Secretary Thompson. My grandpa is a 3-term veteran, former Secretary Thompson. My maternal grandpa was General Thompson, who died on the battlefield defending our nation. My brother is young General Thompson, guarding the frontier. I couldn't care less about the Queen's throne. To be frank, outside of this magnificent palace, whether it's the capital or the entire state of New York, I could pretty much do whatever I wanted. Yet, I found myself entangled in this royal palace. I could no longer enjoy the freedom I once had, and it broke my heart. It was all the fault of that jerk King Edward and his parents. These royals are incredibly cunning and manipulative. They toy with my family, the Thompsons, like puppets. My father was King Edward's tutor. So, from the age of 6, Edward followed me around like a little shadow. King Edward's dad, the late king, was an oddball among royalty. As the supreme ruler, he was devoted solely to the late queen. However, despite their efforts, they only had one son. Thus, Edward grew up to be quite a mischievous rascal. Let's just say, even the palace dogs avoided him. He was probably known as the dog's bane. The late king thought New York would fall apart if this continued, so he packed Edward off to our house, dumping this hot potato on my dad. Everyone in New York knew my dad, Secretary Thompson, was a good educator. To be honest, even the male dogs in our family compound had to march in perfect step and behave properly. Thinking about it, it's a good thing I was born a Thompson daughter. Otherwise, just look at my brother, young General Thompson. He preferred the harsh frontier conditions to being at home and was always cheerful about it. On the first day 6-year-old Edward came to our house, my dad's exact words were, "Your Majesty, whether you are the prince or anyone else, since the king has entrusted you to me, I must fulfill my duty as a tutor. From today on, Your Highness will rise at 5 a.m. daily for half an hour of morning reading. Then, you will wash up and eat breakfast. At 10 a.m., you will practice martial arts to strengthen your body. After lunch at 11 a.m., you may rest for 15 minutes. In the afternoon, you will study military strategy and tactics. At 4 p.m., you will practice calligraphy and recite poetry. At 6 p.m., after dinner, you will write policy essays. At 9 p.m., you will wash up and go to bed." And so, Edward began nearly 10 years of grueling life. Not only did he have to study, but he also had to babysit me. When Edward turned 15 and finally looked somewhat presentable, like a handsome young man, the late king's health began to decline. He called his son back to oversee the kingdom, and less than a year later, the late king passed away. Edward went from being the prince to the king. Edward's mother, Queen Eleanor, also passed away 6 months after the late king. Queen Eleanor was beautiful and gentle, and she used to hold my little hand and give me delicious pastries. So, when she passed away, I cried very genuinely. Before she died, Queen Eleanor called for Edward, my dad, and me. With tears in her eyes, she clutched my hand and told my dad, "The Thompsons are a family of loyal subjects. The Edwards can secure the throne thanks to your family. Edward studied with you since he was young, and he respects you greatly. I am leaving now. Edward is in this deep palace, and I don't know who he can trust. My last wish is for Charlotte to become queen. Although she is young, she can be raised in the palace until she comes of age for marriage. Secretary Thompson, rest assured, Edward will surely cherish and respect Charlotte." My dad looked at Queen Eleanor, who was holding on to her last breath, her eyes full of expectation, and finally nodded. So, I was packed off to the palace and became King Edward's queen. I initially thought, being queen, so what? Aside from the journey home being a bit long, what could be different? But on my first night in the palace, as I gazed at the empty Phoenix Hall, I couldn't help but cry. At first, I didn't dare cry out loud, only whimpering softly, but the palace was so vast that my soft sobs echoed back to me, sounding like a ghost. It scared me so much that I started to wail. Crying, I lamented my tragic fate. I was barely 11 years old, and had to leave my mother to stay in this huge, empty palace, becoming some cursed queen. As I cried, a familiar presence enveloped me. He sighed and said, "So troublesome, why are you crying?" Hearing that annoying voice, I knew it was Edward. I grabbed his clothes, wiping my snot and tears on him, and choked out, "Brother Edward, I miss my mom. I want to go home. I don't want to be queen anymore." Edward didn't agree or disagree. He patted my back to comfort me. After I finally calmed down, he suddenly asked me, "Have you ever eaten osmanthus-flavored steamed chestnut cake?" My little mind paused, and after a moment, I replied, "No, tomorrow. I'll have someone make it for you, but you have to sleep nicely." I thought about it. Osmanthus-flavored steamed chestnut cake sounded delicious. So, after a long inner struggle, I finally succumbed to the allure of food. I hung my head and whispered, "Okay." Edward seemed satisfied and was about to leave. I quickly grabbed his sleeve. "But you have to sleep with me. I'm scared." Edward and I stared at each other in the dark, in a stalemate for a long while. Finally, he reluctantly agreed. Before falling asleep, I think I heard him muttering in frustration, "This little girl is so much trouble." During the day, I ate various exquisite pastries Edward found for me, and a large group of palace maids and eunuchs played games with me. Gradually, I forgot about going home. When night came, I would consciously run to Edward's pure serenity palace and climb onto his bed. Edward would grab me by the collar, like pulling a radish, lift me up, and coldly tell me to go back to Phoenix Hall and sleep alone. I'd hold back tears, staring at him pitifully. Half an incense stick later, I successfully claimed half of Edward's royal bed and fell comfortably into a dream, leaving Edward with a dark expression, covering the other half of the quilt, watching me drool and rub against his robes. Life in the palace was truly boring. Edward was busy every day. He'd wake up before dawn for morning court, then summon officials. After lunch, he'd rest briefly, then go back to reviewing memorials and reading. Every time I went to find him to play, I'd see stacks of memorials on his desk, like a small mountain. It was even more tiring than when he studied at my house. In contrast, I had nothing to do. During the day, I'd fly kites with the palace maids and eunuchs, play eagle catches chick, play hide-and-seek by the rockeries, and fish by the lake in the imperial garden. The food and clothes in the palace were excellent, everything exquisite and unique. After living there for more than half a year, I gradually got used to it. Except for occasionally missing my mother, everything else was fine. On my 14th birthday, Edward, for the first time ever, put down his mountain of memorials. He took out 2 simple outfits, planning to take me out of the palace to play. We secretly rode in an inconspicuous carriage and left the palace through a side gate. It had been a very long time since I had been to the capital's market. The bustling sounds of hawkers made everything seem new and exciting. I skipped around, looking left and right. I bought candied hawthorn, then wanted chestnut cakes. After buying chestnut cakes, I wanted crispy pancakes. Edward dutifully followed behind me, paying and carrying my purchases. By noon, I was tired. Edward led me into a private room at a restaurant and ordered a few small dishes for us to rest. While waiting for the food, I giggled and leaned against Edward, asking him why he had time to take me out today. Edward rolled his eyes and said, "Isn't it your birthday? Can't you mind your image?" "What's wrong with my image?" I countered. "The day before yesterday, Mrs. Davis, the Duchess of the State, came to the palace and praised me, saying, 'Oh, Her Majesty the Queen is growing more beautiful by the day, and her words and actions are dignified and graceful, without losing elegance.'" I mimicked Mrs. Davis's voice, making Edward laugh. He lightly tapped my head and scoffed, "She's just flattering you, and you believe it." Mrs. Davis also praised Minister Lu's daughter for her willow-like fragility. "Minister Lu's daughter is quite the strong one, like Lin Diyu pulling out a weeping willow. Every time she sees me at a palace banquet, I'm afraid she'll accidentally break the table with too much force." Edward saw me pouting and silent, so he thought for a moment and then tried to coax me. "But you really have grown a lot. I can tell by the amount of food sent daily to Phoenix Hall. I swear, if Edward wasn't the king, I might have poisoned him." He was implying I ate too much. I decided to ignore him. By the time we finished eating and were heading back to the palace, the sun was already setting. Edward didn't take me in a carriage. Instead, he held my hand and walked leisurely back to the palace, saying it was for digestion. "Edward, look, doesn't that cloud look like a little dog?" I asked, swinging his hand and looking around. "No imagination." He scoffed at my country bumpkin in the big city demeanor. "Why, I haven't seen the sky outside the palace in ages." I pouted indignantly. "You dislike the palace so much?" Edward asked, looking down at me. Not exactly dislike it. Anyway, you're with me, right? I thought seriously, then looked up at him. It's just a bit boring, not like when we were at my house, so free, we could go out whenever we wanted, and go buy Mrs. Wong's steamed cream cheese anytime, perhaps reminded of those years at the Thompson Manor. Edward was in a good mood after hearing my words. He hooked his lips and said, "I'll take you out to play again if there's a chance." I excitedly waved my arms and cheered. Okay, you promise." Before I could finish, I heard a sharp whoosh. An arrow shot straight towards us. Edward quickly pulled me into his arms. By the time I reacted, a circle of royal guards had suddenly appeared. I saw Edward's face, pale as paper, and the shoulder of his clothes soaked. I reached up and felt my hand covered in blood. The king taking the queen out of the palace and encountering assassins was clearly no small matter. To avoid unrest in the court, Edward chose to conceal the news. The guards quickly dealt with the assassins. They were just a few disorganized thugs, nothing to worry about. Then, they sent Edward and me back to the palace. By the time we returned to the Pure Serenity Palace, the royal physician was already waiting. Edward had lost too much blood from the arrow wound and had fainted. I tightly clutched Edward's hand, staring intently at the physician who was taking his pulse. The physician felt a lot of pressure under my gaze. "How is he?" I asked eagerly after the physician finished taking his pulse and examining the wound. "Your Majesty, please rest assured, although there is an urgent need for immediate action, and your servant has worked tirelessly, I observe that His Majesty's pulse is smooth and strong, flowing without obstruction." I impatiently interrupted his long-winded speech. "Just tell me directly, is it serious or not?" The physician saw my displeased expression and dared not babble further. Nodding, "Reporting to your Majesty, His Majesty is fine. He has only lost too much blood and fallen into a coma. He merely needs the arrow removed from his shoulder and a few days of rest." Only then did I feel relieved. I sat by his side, watching the physician remove the arrow from Edward, bandage him up, and then bring a bowl of herbal medicine to feed him. However, Edward, being in a coma, couldn't drink the medicine. The physician tried several methods without success, getting increasingly anxious. "All right, you can leave," I said, unable to watch any longer. I waved my hand, dismissing the physician and all the servants. For a moment, only Edward and I remained in the hall. I looked at his pale face, feeling incredibly sad. In that critical moment, he had protected me, taking the arrow himself. Otherwise, it would have been me lying there. I picked up the herbal medicine, thought for a moment, then used my mouth to pry open his lips and fed him spoonful by spoonful. This medicine was truly bitter, and my eyes welled up with tears. Edward woke up in the middle of the night. When he awoke, I was fast asleep, sprawled out beside his bed, drooling all over his hand. "Wake up," Edward said, shaking me with a dark expression. "You're awake." I rubbed my eyes, still groggy, and said in surprise, "Why are you sleeping here? Aren't you afraid of catching a cold?" He got up and used his uninjured left hand to help me up. I had been squatting beside his bed for too long, and my legs were numb. I sat trembling on the bed, rubbing my legs. "It's because you wouldn't wake up," I said. "You scared me so much. I just wanted to stay by your bed so I'd be the first to know when you woke up." As I spoke, I remembered him being shot by the arrow, covered in blood. I sniffed and gently touched his right shoulder. "Does it still hurt?" Edward looked at me and chuckled, then said, "My thoughtless little girl now knows how to worry." My tears instantly receded. I gave him a cold glance, kicked off my shoes, rolled into his bed, wrapped myself in the blanket, and said, "Go to sleep." Ha 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 ha. He was in a good mood. He lay down on my outer side, then turned to face me. "I'm fine. It doesn't hurt at all." Just as I was about to fall asleep, he suddenly whispered in my ear, "Why didn't you dodge? With your skills, dodging an arrow would be easy." I thought for a moment, then bravely leaned closer to him, perhaps because I was so close. In the dim candlelight of the hall, Edward's face was uncharacteristically flushed. "If I dodged, what would happen to you?" I asked. He cleared his throat, uncomfortably turning his head. "Hey, your face is red." I felt a new sense of curiosity and leaned even closer, staring at him. "Charlotte, do you know there's a difference between men and women?" Edward said, gritting his teeth in frustration. Then he used his left hand to push me away a bit. "Isn't difference between men and women referring to men and women? What does it have to do with us?" I said, wrapped in the blanket. still trying to get closer to him. In your eyes, am I not a man? Edward pursed his lips, looking at me with a dangerous glint in his eyes. His gaze scared me, and I shrank back, then obediently stopped moving. Taking advantage of his injured right hand and his limited movement, I maneuvered his arm and skillfully snuggled into his embrace. Then, acting spoiled, I said, okay, time to sleep. You owe me this. Edward grumbled above my head but habitually wrapped his arms around me. We had a good night's sleep. King Edward had a tough time. Even injured, he had to attend morning court. Thankfully, his injury wasn't serious and had almost healed. That day, I squatted by the entrance of Pure Serenity Palace, waiting for him to return from court for breakfast. Edward spotted my fluffy head from afar and found it amusing. Your Majesty, can you please mind your manners? I'm hungry, I said, pouting miserably as I approached him. The palace maids and eunuchs skillfully went to prepare our breakfast. If you're hungry, eat first. Didn't I say you don't have to wait for me? You're a patient. How could I bear not to wait for you and eat by myself? When did you become so sensible? Edward glanced at me. Be honest, what do you want now? Hee, brother Edward, you really understand me, I said, grinning as I hugged his left arm. You only call me brother Edward when you want something. Normally, it's just Edward. Edward was very resentful. Hee, brother Edward, I said, smiling and swinging his arm. All right, I can't take it anymore. Just tell me what you want. I'll agree to it. Edward couldn't stand my tactic. He shivered and pulled his hand away. I heard my brother is back. I want to go home for a visit, I said, batting my big eyes at him. Home again? Didn't you just go back last month? I continued batting my eyes at him. Charlotte, can't you be a more dutiful queen? You run home every day. What kind of queen is that? I kept batting my eyes at him. Be back before dark, Edward finally said, frustrated and annoyed. Hee, definitely. Wait for me tonight. I immediately ran off to have the carriage prepared. Edward bit into a duck leg. Annoyed. I hadn't seen my brother in years. My brother is 8 years older than me. Before he went to the frontier at 14, he and Edward were always partners in crime. The three of us would always conspire to cause trouble behind my dad's back. If we got caught, I'd bat my innocent eyes, and Edward would do the same. Then my dad would get angry and punish my brother. Just kidding. My brother was the oldest, so of course, he took the fall. My brother, Robert, went to the frontier at 14 very happily, as if he was starting a new life. Edward and I, on the other hand, tearfully saw him off at the city gate. Brother, be careful and come home often. Edward, Robert, can you not leave? What will I do without you? Recalling how many years it had been since I last saw my brother, I rushed into the Thompson Manor. My mother was already accustomed to my habit of just showing up without notice, and my dad was too lazy to scold me anymore. Brother, you're back, I shouted, running and looking for him. Charlotte, you're 14 now. Can't you be a little more composed? After a long time, my brother, Robert, had grown much taller and his skin was a bit darker. Brother, I missed you so much. I jumped and hugged his arm, acting spoiled. You're already the queen, yet you're still so childish, my brother said, smiling as he patted me. Then he asked, by the way, how is the king treating you? Has he given you any trouble? I tilted my head, thought for a long time, and honestly shook my head. No, Edward treats me very well. You girl, how many times have I told you not to call the king by his first name? My dad said, slapping the table, scolding me. All right, I know. I stuck out my tongue. Then I continued pestering my brother to tell me about his life on the frontier. By the time I returned to the palace, it was already dark. I tiptoed into the Pure Serenity Palace and saw Edward sitting on the bed in his silk robes, lost in thought. Hearing my footsteps, he turned his head and said blandly, you finally decided to come back. Hee. I lost track of time and was a bit late. Why are you still waiting for me? I took off my outer robe and flopped onto the soft quilt, lazily saying, didn't you tell me to wait for you? He glanced at me, my eyes darted around. He seemed a bit angry, so I shamelessly went up to him, hugged his arm, and said, Brother Edward, my brother got so much darker. He's practically like a sunburnt general. You're still more handsome, fair and soft. Edward helplessly patted my hand and told the maids to come in and help me wash up. When I returned after washing, Edward was reading. The candlelight reflected on his face, casting faint shadows. After all, he was a majestic emperor, and his serious, silent demeanor was somewhat unfamiliar to me. He heard my movement, turned to look at me, standing there barefoot and lightly dressed. He rolled his eyes and said, "Are you crazy? Aren't you afraid of catching a cold? Come over here." It was the familiar Edward again. I scurried over and hugged his arm, falling into a dream. Original creator Willow reminds you to stay tuned for more. Chapter 2. Time flew by unknowingly. It was winter in the blink of an eye. Thick snow fell overnight, bending the red plum blossoms in the courtyard. After the new year, I would turn 15 and be old enough for the coming-of-age ceremony. The Ministry of Rites had already put the imperial wedding on the agenda. When Edward returned from morning court today, his face was displeased. I quietly asked eunuch George what had happened. George told me that during morning court, someone had brought up the king's age, suggesting he shouldn't leave the imperial harem empty while waiting for the queen's coming of age. They advised the king to take suitable women from prominent families as concubines. The king's face turned very dark, and he punished the offending censor with a flogging. Morning court ended unhappily. Actually, I knew the minister's concerns. The late king had only favored Queen Eleanor during his lifetime, leaving the harem virtually empty. Fortunately, there was Edward, an enemy, to inherit the throne. Otherwise, wouldn't the New York monarchy have no successor? These people were very concerned about Edward's imperial offspring, but Edward himself wasn't in a hurry. This was a case of the king isn't anxious, but the ministers are. I picked some budding plum blossoms from the courtyard and arranged them in a porcelain vase. Edward was currently reviewing memorials at his desk. "Edward?" I thought for a moment and called him softly. He looked up at me. "HM?" I scratched my head, thinking about my words. "Don't blame those ministers. They just want you to have children soon." "You also want me to take concubines?" His eyes held a hint of gloom that I couldn't understand. "It's not that I want to or don't want to." I suddenly didn't know what to say, but then I remembered my duty as queen and put on a magnanimous air. "It's my concern as queen to ensure the royal lineage prospers, isn't it?" Edward didn't speak. He put down his brush, leaned back in his chair, and watched me. "Who taught you those words?" I thought of them myself. Why would anyone need to teach me? I shrunk my neck a little, feeling guilty. "I'll ask you again. Who taught you?" Edward dangerously narrowed his eyes at me. "All right, Mrs. Davis, the Duchess, told me a few days ago. She said you're already over 20 and don't have an heir, so I, as queen, should worry about it and arrange things." My voice got softer and softer. "What an idiot." Edward scoffed and walked towards me. "Mrs. Davis wants to put her youngest daughter in the palace." He pulled me down to sit, gently tucking stray hairs behind my ear. His tone was a bit coaxing as he asked, "Tell me, if I really let a beautiful woman into the palace, and I ate with her every day and slept with her every night, would you be unhappy?" I thought about it. For all these years, I had slept in the same bed as Edward. If another woman came, and Edward could only be with her, what would I do when it thundered or rained at night and I was scared and couldn't sleep? So, I shook my head, feeling that letting Edward take other women into the palace was indeed not a good idea. "Then that's that," he said, "so don't say such things again in the future, or I'll really get angry." Edward was very satisfied with my reaction, smiling and nodding. "Then let me go play." That night, as I was drifting in and out of sleep, I thought I felt someone kiss my forehead. I waved my hand and mumbled, "Brother Edward, don't bother me." Then, vaguely, I heard a soft voice saying, "Little girl, hurry up and grow up." I was annoyed by the noise in my ear, so I rolled over and continued to sleep soundly. The Ministry of Rites had chosen an auspicious day, a bright and sunny one. I wore the heavy queen's phoenix crown on my head and an elaborate, intricately detailed queen's gown. With the help of the palace attendants, I ascended the steps one by one towards Edward. Today, Edward wore a vibrant red wedding gown. I rarely saw him dressed in such bright colors. His handsome brows and eyes held a hint of tenderness as he gazed at me gently. Just as I was about to step onto the last stair, he reached out his hand to support me. George swallowed the words, "Your Majesty, this is not in accordance with protocol." With a trembling voice, after bowing to our ancestors, we had to receive the homage of loyal officials. All day long, I was dizzy and dazed, led by Edward to kneel and stand. Kneel and stand. Finally, when the ceremony was complete and I was sent to the bridal chamber, I was so tired I could have fallen asleep standing up. Edward entered in his crimson wedding robe and saw me dozing off, leaning against the bedpost. The nearby matchmaker and maids didn't dare to wake me. Watching Edward nervously, he smiled and waved his hand, dismissing everyone. Then, he gently woke me up. I was still a bit groggy after being woken. Edward's handsome face was before my eyes, so I completely trusted him and threw myself into his arms. "Let me take off your phoenix crown. It must be very heavy after wearing it for so long," he said. He gently removed my phoenix crown and the intricate hairstyle. "So tired," I whimpered, collapsing there, letting Edward remove layer after layer of my wedding gown. Finally, I sat on the bed in just my red silk underclothes. Edward's gaze on me was a little different. I followed his gaze down to myself and saw my well-developed, curvy figure. I defensively clutched my clothes together, looking at him warily. "You pervert." Edward found it amusing. He took off his outer robe and also sat on the bed, looking down at me. "I'm your husband. How am I a pervert?" I was speechless for a moment, but my heart was pounding. So, I acted spoiled, wrapped myself in the quilt, buried my head inside, and remained silent. After a moment, Edward's muffled laughter came. "All right, don't suffocate yourself. You're still young. I won't touch you." Before the wedding, the governess had taught me some things that made my face blush. So, his explicit words made my face flush and my heart pound. I slowly peeked my head out from the quilt, not daring to look into his eyes, only snuggling closer to him. He extended his long arm and pulled me into his embrace. I was about to run, but he threatened, "Don't move around, or don't blame me for not keeping my promise." So, I obediently stayed still. After a while, Edward's breathing gradually stabilized. Only then did I relax and fall asleep too. On the second day of the wedding, Edward pricked his finger and dabbed the blood onto the wedding cloth before showing it. Throughout, I was blushing like a quail. Edward found my appearance very amusing, so he gradually started teasing me. "TSK, TSK, the fearless Charlotte has grown up. She even knows how to be shy now." I angrily pushed him and ran off. That night, before sleeping, I felt a bit troubled. By custom, I should sleep in the Phoenix Hall, where the Empress resided. However, since I was young when I entered the palace, I had clung to Edward and always slept with him in his Pure Serenity Palace. Now, after the grand wedding, it seemed a bit improper for me to continue sleeping with him in Pure Serenity Palace every night. After much deliberation, I still returned to Phoenix Hall with my young palace maid. It had been a long time since I had slept alone in Phoenix Hall. The cold, empty sleeping quarters made me feel a bit uncomfortable, but I thought to myself that I would have to get used to it. Just as I finished washing and was preparing to try to sleep, without any announcement from a servant, Edward himself entered my sleeping quarters with a dark expression. I looked at him in confusion. "What are you doing here?" He pulled me out of the quilt and asked. Seeing his dark, displeased face, I still didn't understand why he was angry, so I simply told the truth. "I'm sleeping." "When did you get so brave? Sleeping by yourself in Phoenix Hall? How old do you think I am? Am I still afraid to sleep alone?" I retorted, agitated. "You are afraid," Edward said coldly. Then he took off his outer robe and nimbly jumped onto my bed, pulling me into his arms. I was left with a head full of questions. What's wrong with Edward? Coming to Phoenix Hall to fight for my bed? "Edward, are you crazy?" I blurted out what was on my mind. "Shut up." I saw Edward's temple twitch and wisely kept my mouth shut. "You blockhead," Edward cursed softly. "From now on, you'll still live in Pure Serenity Palace." I puffed out my cheeks but didn't argue. Recently, foreign lands had presented a pair of large koi fish, which were kept in the Imperial Garden Lake. I found them very rare and clamored to see them. However, these koi were very cunning, always appearing and disappearing, often hiding under the lotus leaves. I couldn't see them from the shore and was quite anxious. One day, I finally couldn't bear it anymore and had a young palace maid get me a small boat, planning to search deep among the lotus leaves. "Your Majesty, His Majesty warned you not to go too deep," the young palace maid said, a little troubled. "Oh, what's there to be afraid of? I'll paddle the boat myself. It'll be fine." I had been adventurous since childhood. Climbing trees and catching fish was no problem for me. Ignoring the young palace maid's words, I paddled the small, single-person boat deep into the lotus pond. The further in I went, the more lotus leaves there were, gradually obstructing my view. Suddenly, a large frog jumped onto the bow, startling me. I lost my balance, and the small boat tilted and plunged into the water. As I flailed and gurgled, I heard the shouts of palace attendants from afar. "Oh no, the Empress has fallen into the water." Before I passed out, I thought to myself, what's the use of shouting? Hurry and save me. When I woke up, it was already evening. My head was still spinning. My young palace maid, Ivy, was wiping away tears beside me, complaining, Your Majesty, you really are something. Thankfully, you're fine this time. Or what would I do? I knew I had caused trouble this time, so I quickly put on a flattering smile to coax her. Oh, Ivy, don't cry. See, I'm fine, aren't I? By the way, no one told the king, right? If Edward knew about this, he'd scold me relentlessly. Your Majesty, it was His Majesty who saved you, Ivy said. I sighed in resignation. Oh no, I'm in trouble now. Where is he? I asked Ivy. His Majesty was here the whole time. Just now, Eunuch George said the Minister of Personnel had something urgent to discuss with His Majesty, so he left. Before leaving, he specifically instructed me that if you woke up, you weren't allowed to go anywhere and should wait for him here. I suspected Edward was my secret keeper. How did he know I wanted to wander off? Soon after, Edward returned. His face was displeased. As he entered the sleeping quarters, he waved his hand, dismissing all the servants. I smiled ingratiatingly at him. Hee, you're back. Edward's silent, stern demeanor was still quite intimidating. He sat at the table with a dark expression and elegantly poured himself a cup of tea. Edward, I called him. He ignored me. I thought for a moment, then scurried off the bed and ingratiatingly approached him. Edward, why aren't you talking to me? Are you angry? I promise, I won't do it again next time. Edward remained unmoved, continuing to drink his tea. Oh, don't be angry. I know I caused trouble. Please don't be angry. I really won't go there to play again in the future. I promised solemnly. He still ignored me. I had no choice but to hang my head, miserably snatch his tea, put my face close to his, and look at him with teary eyes. Brother Edward, I know I was wrong. Please don't stay silent. If you don't talk, I'm scared. After a long moment, Edward sighed in frustration and fiercely poked my head. When will you stop making me worry? Seeing that he finally acknowledged me, I felt relieved. So, I took a sip of tea from his cup, sat beside him, and whispered, It's all that frog's fault. My boat handling skills were really good originally. You still say that? Do you know how deep that lotus pond is? If I hadn't happened to be nearby and saved you, you wouldn't be seeing me right now. Do you understand? I thought it would be fine just using a small boat, I said. Edward dangerously narrowed his eyes and leaned closer to me. It seems you still don't think you were wrong. No, I was wrong. I really was wrong. I quickly raised my hands in surrender. Then, ingratiatingly, I hugged his arm and acted spoiled. Then, the feeling on my chest was a bit different. I followed Edward's ambiguous gaze downwards a few inches. I looked at my thinly clad chest pressed against his arm and didn't know what to say. Charlotte, you'll be 17 in a few months, right? No, I'm only 16, I said, sensing his malicious gaze, and quickly jumped up, trying to escape. Unexpectedly, he grabbed me by the collar, lifted me up, and strode towards the bed. He threw me onto it and raised an eyebrow at me. You're not small anymore. It's time for you to grow up. The truth is, you can't easily provoke a man who has been deprived for a long time. After the coming-of-age ceremony, every time I slept with Edward, there were moments he almost couldn't control himself. But in the end, he would always go take a cold bath with a dark expression. This time, he must have been really angry. He kept bothering me until midnight, making me cry and beg him to stop, calling out Brother Edward. If he hadn't been worried about causing me alarm or hurting me too much, he wouldn't have stopped. I was so tired that I slept until afternoon the next day. When I woke up, my whole body felt sore as if it had been taken apart. Just as I was clutching my waist and cursing Edward through gritted teeth, he returned to the room after finishing his official duties. I saw him enter the sleeping quarters with a radiant expression and quickly wrapped myself in the quilt, leaving only my head exposed. Edward was amused by my actions. Are you afraid I'll eat you? You already act like a beast, I mumbled softly. All right, get up and have lunch, he said. He sat at the table and had the servants bring in exquisite dishes. I thought for a moment. My stomach was truly hungry, so I slowly and blushingly sat opposite him and started eating. He found my guarding against a thief demeanor amusing but didn't stop me. He elegantly served me a bowl of soup and placed it in front of me. Original creator Willow reminds you to stay tuned for more. Chapter 3. A few months later, it was my 17th birthday. After a day of festivities, I met my parents and received gifts from my brother, who was far away at the frontier. That night, I was happily lounging on the bed, playing with my gifts, when Edward returned. He saw me, his little queen, with her fair feet, wearing a light green silk gown, happily rolling around on the bed. Edward's eyes became increasingly dangerous. When Edward moved in close, I stared at him with innocent, wide eyes. "What are you doing? What do you think?" Edward smiled wickedly, and his large hand restlessly reached under my clothes. "No, stop. I have something serious to tell you," I said, breathing lightly as I gently pushed his hand away. "Tell me later," he said impatiently, his hands still moving. Just as he was about to thrust into me, I quickly escaped his embrace and ran to the corner of the bed. Edward looked at me with a dejected expression. "I said I have something serious to tell you first," I muttered, pouting, from a distance. "What is it?" Edward asked, very frustrated and gritting his teeth. I rolled my eyes, then snuggled up to him and hugged him. Then, I whispered in his ear, "You're going to be a dad." Edward was stunned. I had never seen him like that before. It wasn't until I impatiently pushed him for the third time that he reacted. Then, he jumped up and shouted, "Call the royal physician! Call the royal physician!" I secretly shook my head. Where had His usual Majesty gone? A few months later, after a day of labor pains, I gave birth to a rosy, chubby baby boy. Edward held his son, smiling brightly. "What should we name him?" I asked Edward. I had thought for a long time and decided that the name Edward Charlotte was excellent, containing both my family name and his name. Edward looked at me with affection. "Edward Charlotte." I thought for a moment and agreed. "It sounds good." Spring passed and autumn came. Little Edward Charlotte was already 5 years old. He looked like a little adult, reciting books with a stern face, very much like his dad. Not cute at all. I pouted and poked his little face, teasing him. "Son, give mommy a smile, won't you?" Edward Charlotte was used to my actions and tried very hard to give me a smile. "You're just like your dad, not cute at all." I sighed. "What are you saying?" Edward returned from court and sat beside me, gently putting his arm around me. "Nothing." I glanced at him, secretly annoyed. After having the servants take Edward Charlotte away, I very seriously told Edward, "Your Majesty, I don't want to be queen anymore." Edward looked at me, perplexed. "This palace is too boring. When can I live freely outside the palace?" I sighed, looking out the window. "You want to go out and play, don't you?" Edward looked at me amusedly and then said, "All right, I'll let you go home for a visit for a couple of days." "All right? You said it. No going back on your word." I immediately flipped over like a carp after hearing him, telling Ivy to help me pack. I immediately got into the prepared carriage, determined to leave the palace. Edward looked at me with a puzzled expression. He called Ivy over and asked, "What's wrong with the queen?" Ivy looked completely bewildered. "Perhaps she's eager to tell Secretary Thompson and Mrs. Thompson the good news." "Good news? What good news?" Ivy looked even more bewildered. "It's the good news that Her Majesty is pregnant." "Charlotte, you come back here," Edward roared in helpless fury. End of text.